The thunderous sound of jet engines tore through the quiet morning sky, shattering the silence above a small rural cemetery nestled between rolling hills and old oak trees. 6 sleek blue and gold fighter jets, the Blue Angels, sliced through the air in flawless diamond formation, their wings glinting in the early sunlight. Below them, a solitary woman stood motionless, tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she stared up at the heavens. It was a moment so powerful, so profound, that time itself seemed to hold its breath. Those jets weren't just flying over any cemetery. They were flying over a single grave, the final resting place of a Navy mechanic who had been dead for over 3 decades. A man who, until just weeks ago, had been completely forgotten by the outside world, except by her. A woman who had come here alone every single Saturday for 30 years, regardless of the weather, the season, or her own circumstances. No parades, no family reunions, no ceremonies, just her. How did such relentless devotion, 3 decades of quiet, unwavering remembrance, lead to this unimaginable tribute by the Navy's most elite pilots? Let's rewind. Let's go back to where it all began. Her name was Emma Carter, and for 3 full decades, she had followed a routine that never changed. Every Saturday morning, without fail, she'd rise before the sun, dress in the same warm cardigan no matter the season, and drive her aging silver Honda Civic down a winding country road that snaked through the farmlands outside of town. Her destination? Willowgate Cemetery, an old, nearly forgotten burial ground on the edge of the county, where time had worn away most of the names on the headstones and wild grass grew tall around the stones no one visited anymore. Emma would always park beneath the same ancient oak tree, the one whose sprawling branches cast long shadows across the rows of graves. From there, she'd walk the same path, worn down by her own footsteps over the years, to the farthest corner of the cemetery, the part no one ever visited, the part where the oldest headstones leaned sideways from years of neglect. And there, waiting in quiet stillness, was his grave. The headstone was simple, modest, unadorned, except for the essentials, etched into the weathered surface of gray military granite. Petty Officer, First Class, Nathaniel J. Carter, United States Navy, 1943 to 1967. Beloved son and brother. That was it. No elaborate monument, no flowers left by strangers, no commemorative plaques or stories in the newspaper. Just a name, a title, and 2 dates, separated by the dash that contained an entire life. But Emma knew the story behind that dash. She brought with her the same 3 things each time she came. A small bouquet of fresh-cut flowers from the garden she'd kept thriving year after year. A crisp, folded American flag on a wooden stick, always replaced if faded or torn. And a well-worn thermos of hot black coffee. She would place the flowers gently beneath the headstone, plant the flag in the soil next to it, and then sit down on a stone bench she'd saved up to have installed 15 years ago. That bench had cost her 3 months of grocery money, but she'd never once regretted it. For her, it wasn't just a bench. It was a sacred place of memory, of connection, of mourning, and of love. And then she'd talk, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for hours. Her voice, soft and tremulous at first, would grow steadier as she recounted the details of her week. Her work at the local elementary school where she taught 2nd grade, the neighborhood gossip, her struggles with loneliness, her children, now grown and living far away, the book she was reading, the news she thought Uncle Nate would have had opinions about, even the birds she'd seen building nests outside her kitchen window. Every word was for him, because he had died far too young, because no one else remembered, because someone had to. Emma had only been 8 years old when her uncle, Nate Carter, died. He was her father's younger brother, and he had always been her favorite. A big-hearted Navy mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a laugh so loud it shook the windows. He'd promised her, during one of his brief visits home, that when he got back from his deployment, he'd teach her everything about engines. "Just you wait, Squirt," he'd said, ruffling her hair. "You're going to be the first Carter girl who can rebuild a carburetor blindfolded." But he never came back. The official version of events, the one given to the family, was heartbreakingly vague. A tragic training accident at Naval Air Station Monarch, where Nate had been stationed. Something about a mechanical malfunction. Something about bad luck. No one to blame. Just a terrible, senseless incident. That's what the Navy said. But Emma remembered what she heard late at night, when her parents thought she was asleep. Whispered conversations, words like cover-up, phrases like he tried to stop it, and silence. Long, heavy silences that said more than words ever could. She didn't understand all of it back then, but she understood one thing. Uncle Nate hadn't just died. He'd done something brave, and someone had made sure that part got buried. As she grew older, Emma began to piece it together. Bits of conversations. A letter she'd found hidden in her father's desk. The way her mother had once snapped at a family friend for casually calling it just an accident. There was more to the story. There had always been more, but no one talked about it. So Emma took on the burden, quietly, steadily, faithfully, every Saturday, for 30 years. No one asked her to. No one even noticed. Her own children had stopped asking where she went on the weekends. Her daughter, during one especially tense holiday dinner, had even said, "Mom, you were just a little kid when he died. You didn't even know him that well. Why are you still doing this? Maybe it's time to let go." But Emma couldn't, because someone had to remember, because he mattered, and because love like that doesn't fade. It roots itself so deeply that it becomes part of who you are. The world had forgotten Nathaniel Carter, but Emma never did, and that's where this story truly begins. There were weeks when the loneliness was so heavy, so consuming, that it felt like Emma could barely breathe under the weight of it. She'd sit there on that cold stone bench, the steam from her thermos of coffee swirling up into the empty morning air, talking to a headstone as if it were a living person, her voice trembling, the only sound breaking the stillness of the forgotten graveyard. She would talk, and sometimes she would cry. Sometimes the words came easily. Sometimes they didn't come at all. There were Saturdays when the sky above was gray and heavy with clouds, when the wind howled through the branches of the oaks, and the leaves scattered across the graves like tiny whispers from another world. On those days, Emma would pull her cardigan tighter, stare at the name engraved in granite, and wonder, was she losing her mind? She'd spent 30 years keeping this vigil. 30 years of keeping the memory of a man alive when no one else even remembered he existed. Her friends didn't understand. Her neighbors certainly didn't. Even her children, now grown and living states away, had long stopped asking about her weekly routine. "Mom," her daughter had said once, frustration simmering in her voice, "you never really knew him. You were just a little girl when he died. What exactly are you holding on to?" But Emma knew. She wasn't holding on to a memory. She was holding on to truth. The truth that Nate Carter hadn't died because of negligence or misfortune. He'd died because he'd done the right thing, and no one had ever acknowledged that. So every Saturday, without fail, she returned. She updated him on her life, on her job, on her arthritis, on the weather, on the death of her husband years ago, on the fact that her grandkids never wrote letters anymore. She told him about the small joys, the petty grievances, the national news, the school budget meetings. She poured out her soul to the granite slab, like it was the only person left on earth who truly listened. She whispered to him about the changes in the country he died serving, about the things he never got to see, about the wars that came after him, the advances in technology, the rise of new generations. And always, always, she ended with the same words as she placed a new flag next to his grave. Still fighting the good fight, Nate. Still remembering. She didn't know why she said it. Only that it had come to her once, years ago, and now it had become her quiet promise. A mantra, a vow. The cemetery itself had become like a second home. It was quiet there, serene, tucked far off the main roads, hidden between overgrown fields and a cluster of dense trees. Willowgate Cemetery was one of those places that even the town had largely forgotten. The newer sections up front, closer to the entrance, had fresh flowers and shiny plaques and little pinwheels that spun in the wind. But Nate's grave, tucked in the farthest, oldest part of the cemetery, was in a different world. Most weeks, Emma was the only living soul in that back corner. But she wasn't the only one who came to Willowgate regularly. About 5 years ago, another visitor began appearing, not every week, but often enough to be noticed. Captain Michael Rodriguez, a seasoned firefighter with the county department, had started coming after the death of his father. His dad was buried just 3 rows over from Nate. And every other Saturday, Mike would show up in his dark pickup truck, park by the same oak tree as Emma, and walk the same winding path to his father's grave. At first, they never spoke. Mike had noticed her, of course, noticed how precise her routine was, how reverent her silence seemed. He respected that. In his line of work, he understood grief. He understood the way people built rituals around pain. But there was something different about her, something deeper. Devotion on a level he rarely saw, even at firemen funerals or veterans memorials. She came every week. Same time, same order, same careful placement of flag and flowers, same whispered conversations, same thermos of coffee. At first, he tried not to listen, but the cemetery was so quiet that sometimes her voice would carry through the trees, rising just enough on the breeze that words reached his ears, words that made him pause. And one Saturday, in late October, that's exactly what happened. Mike had just finished placing flowers on his father's grave and was walking back toward his truck when he heard her voice. Not loud, but clear. "The Blue Angels are flying over the Naval Academy today, Nate," she was saying, her tone soft and wistful. "I saw it on the news this morning. Remember how you used to talk about them? You said they were the best of the best, flying for everyone who never got the chance." Mike stopped in his tracks. Blue Angels? Naval Academy? Her grave was a Navy grave. "You would have loved to see them," she continued. "All those years you spent working on engines, making sure the pilots could fly safe. You always said the ground crew mattered just as much as the guys in the cockpit." Mike turned, frozen, listening. Something in the way she spoke, not just with reverence, but with knowledge, with specifics, with that tone of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. As a firefighter, Mike had spent decades studying accident reports. He could tell when someone was parroting headlines and when they were speaking from inside knowledge. Emma's words felt like the latter. He lingered, listening a few more seconds, and in those seconds, something shifted. A thread began to tug at the edge of his instincts. There was more to this woman's story than met the eye. And that story, whatever it was, had been sitting quietly beside a forgotten grave for 30 years, waiting for someone to listen. The following Saturday, Captain Mike Rodriguez arrived at Willowgate Cemetery earlier than usual. The morning mist still clung to the grass, and the rising sun hadn't yet dried the dew from the headstones. He parked quietly under the oak tree and waited in his truck, sipping coffee from a thermos of his own, watching the gravel path that led through the cemetery like a worn ribbon through history. He wasn't there for his father's grave this time. He was there for her. Mike didn't know why he felt compelled to return early. Maybe it was the way she'd spoken to the grave, with such reverence and heartbreak. Maybe it was the way she talked about the Blue Angels, like she understood something deeper than just admiration for fast jets and precise flying. Maybe it was the way her voice cracked when she said, "You always said the ground crew was just as important as the men in the cockpit." That line had hit him hard, because in the world of first responders, in the world of quiet, unseen heroes, ground crew meant something. It meant the people who made others' heroism possible. The ones who worked behind the scenes. The ones who rarely got credit. And from the sound of it, Petty Officer Nate Carter had been one of them. So Mike watched. And when Emma arrived, same time, same steps, he watched her from a respectful distance, not intruding, just observing, like a quiet witness to a ritual older than memory. She stepped out of her car, moving slowly, but deliberately. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and she wore the same soft blue sweater she always did. In one hand, she carried her thermos. In the other, a bouquet of yellow tulips and a neatly folded flag. She walked the path, with practiced familiarity, past the rows of headstones without so much as a glance. When she reached Nate's grave, she knelt and placed the flowers at the base, planted the new flag, and brushed leaves off the stone with gentle, almost sacred care. Then she sat, opened the thermos, poured 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for him, and she began to speak. "I read something this week, Nate," she said, her voice just above a whisper. "There's a new protocol for aircraft maintenance. A safety standard they're using now that, well, it might have saved you, if they'd had it back then." Mike's ears perked up. This wasn't just grief. This was technical, specific. "I know you can't hear me," she continued, her voice starting to tremble. "But I want you to know what you did. It mattered. Even if they never told anyone. Even if they swept it under the rug to protect their reputations. You saved them. You did." That word, covered up, slammed into Mike like a freight train. His instincts screamed, this wasn't just a personal loss. This was a buried truth. He couldn't walk away anymore. With the care and calm he used when approaching people in crisis, Mike stood, took a breath, and began to walk slowly toward her. His hands clearly visible, his steps measured and soft. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently. Emma turned sharply, startled. In 30 years of visiting Nate's grave, not a single person had ever spoken to her here. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Mike continued, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is Mike Rodriguez, County Fire Department. I visit my dad. He's buried just over there." Emma blinked, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. I see." "I've seen you here," Mike said carefully, his voice low and steady. "For years, always the same time, always the same grave. And I heard a bit of what you said just now." Emma looked down, embarrassed. "You probably think I'm crazy, sitting here, talking to a headstone." "Not at all," Mike said. "I've been in emergency services for 20 years. I know what grief looks like. But I also know what purpose looks like. And, well, I get the sense that your loved one's story hasn't been told, at least not the way it should be." Emma looked up slowly. Her eyes were cloudy with tears and exhaustion, but there was something else there too. Something that had been buried for decades, a flicker of hope. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," she said quietly. Try me, Mike said. I've heard a lot of stories. The unbelievable ones are usually the most important. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward the headstone, and with a long, shuddering breath, she began to speak. Emma sat in silence for a moment, her eyes fixed on the headstone before her, as if searching it for strength. The air around them was still, the kind of heavy stillness that only exists in graveyards and after storms. Then, with a quiet inhale, she began to speak, not to Mike, but to the past. It was March 1967, she said. Uncle Nate had been stationed at Naval Air Station Monarch in Virginia for just under a year. He was working on the training aircraft, the T-2 Buckeye jets, planes they used to prepare fresh young pilots for real-world combat. They were fast, temperamental, and fragile. He said it was like working on race cars flown by teenagers. Mike nodded slowly, recognizing the model. Buckeyes were notorious back then. Great trainers, but a lot of moving parts. Emma gave a faint smile, one that vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. He loved those planes, not because they were perfect, but because they were challenging. He said every plane had a personality, like a puzzle that could kill you if you misunderstood it. Her voice trembled now. That day, he was doing routine maintenance when he found something wrong. A hydraulic line, hairline crack. It was just about to fail. Mike's firefighter mind immediately filled in the blanks. He'd seen crashes, fires, system failures that could have been avoided. Nate reported it, Emma said, just like he was supposed to. He told his supervisor the aircraft wasn't safe to fly, that it needed to be grounded until the part could be replaced. But his supervisor didn't want to delay the flight schedule. There were senior officers watching that day, visiting brass. Changing the schedule would have been an embarrassment. She turned, eyes glistening, voice tightening. So his supervisor told him to ignore it, said it was probably just a superficial flaw, that there was no time to delay, that they'd check it after the next flight. Mike clenched his jaw. Jesus. But Nate refused, Emma said. He said he wouldn't sign off on it, that it was a death trap. So the supervisor threatened him, told him he'd be written up for insubordination, told him to stop being paranoid. She looked down at her hands, now trembling. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He went back out to the hangar, and he pulled a fuse, quietly, carefully, just enough to disable the ignition system, enough so the plane wouldn't start. He sabotaged it? Mike asked softly. He protected it, Emma replied. He made sure no one could fly it, even if it meant getting in trouble, even if it meant risking his job. Mike felt a chill run down his spine. What happened? He was written up, she said bitterly, for damaging government property, and the plane was taken off the schedule for a few days. But 3 days later, the same aircraft was back in rotation. Another mechanic, someone less experienced, looked it over. Reattached the hydraulic line, did a quick systems check, and cleared it. Mike already knew where this was going, but he couldn't stop listening. They flew it, Emma whispered. 4 people on board, 1 instructor, 3 brand new pilots. The line ruptured during takeoff. The aircraft lost control. It went down. Her voice cracked. Nate was in the hangar when he heard the sirens. He knew what had happened the second he saw the smoke. She took another breath, deeper this time, like pulling herself up from the weight of memory. He didn't wait, she said. He didn't think. He just ran. Grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprinted across the tarmac toward the flames. The rescue crews hadn't even been dispatched yet, but Nate didn't stop. She paused, closing her eyes. He got 2 of them out. 2 of those boys, 18, 19 years old. He pulled them from the wreckage, one by one. He was going back for the third when the fuel tank ignited. Mike's heart was hammering. Oh my God. Emma's eyes were now full of tears. It killed him instantly, and the instructor. The report said it was mechanical failure, a no-fault incident. But Nate had warned them. He tried to stop it, and they buried that truth with him. Mike sat heavily on the edge of the bench, his hands on his knees, staring at the ground. And the Navy? He asked. They gave him a standard funeral, Emma said. Minimal honors, quiet, no mention of the rescue, no acknowledgement of what he did. His supervisor got transferred, no consequences. Did you ever try to find the pilots he saved? Mike asked. I did, she said, pulling something from her purse. It was an old newspaper clipping, folded and yellowed with age. I found this years later, an article about the crash. 3 of the names were listed. She unfolded it carefully, reverently. Lieutenant James Patterson, Lieutenant Robert Felder, Lieutenant Michael Foster. Mike took the clipping, reading the faded text. 3 young faces stared back at him from black and white photos. Survivors. I tried to find them, Emma said, her voice quiet again. But the records were sealed. I wrote letters, made calls. Nothing. Mike looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the pain of 3 decades carved into every line of her face. Emma, he said, his voice steady with new purpose. What if I told you I might be able to find them? She blinked. After all this time? You'd be surprised what firefighters can do when we start pulling on threads. I know people, veterans, paramedics, retired officers. There are public records, alumni lists, VA hospital databases. And if any of these men stayed in the military, there's a paper trail somewhere. Emma's lips parted, but she didn't speak. I can't promise anything, Mike said, but I can promise this. I'm going to try. Because your uncle didn't die in vain. And it's about damn time the world knew that. For a long time, Emma said nothing. She just stared at Mike, this stranger who had appeared from the quiet. And slowly, her shoulders began to shake. Not from sadness, but from something else. Hope. Hope she hadn't felt in 30 years. Commander David Felder paused, the weight of realization settling heavily in his voice. My entire life, he said quietly, every single milestone, my father's career, his marriage to my mother, my own birth, everything I've accomplished. It all comes back to that one moment, that one man. He exhaled, the silence between them thick with reverence. I wouldn't be here if your uncle hadn't made the choice he did that day. I want his family to know. His sacrifice wasn't forgotten. His life created generations. Mike felt his chest tighten. She's going to want to hear that, sir. For 30 years, she wondered if anyone ever knew, ever remembered. They did, David said softly. We did. Then his voice firmed. I don't know what kind of tribute she'd want, but whatever it is, it's not enough. There's no ceremony that can match what he gave us. But we'll do everything we can. Because this is the kind of story the world needs to hear. Mike nodded slowly, even though they were miles apart. I'll tell her. She deserves to hear it. Tell her thank you, Commander Felder said. For remembering, for never letting go, for holding on to the truth when everyone else let it fade. Because of her, my father lived. And because of him, I fly. The call ended, but the story didn't. Later that evening, Mike drove back to Emma's home. The autumn wind whispered through the trees as he stepped onto her porch. She opened the door before he even knocked. Her face already filled with hope and fear, with years of silent prayers that maybe, just maybe, someone would finally understand. He looked her in the eyes. I found them, he said. And then, softly, Emma, one of them became a blue angel. His son flies for them now. Her hands flew to her mouth. She nearly collapsed into the doorway. Mike stepped closer, steadying her. Your uncle saved them, and their families, and their futures. And they know it now. They remember. Emma, they remember. She broke down then, not with the quiet sobs of mourning, but with the full-body release of 30 years of grief finally answered. It was like a dam giving way. Tears, breath, laughter, disbelief all tumbling out at once. When she could finally speak, she whispered, "He mattered. He really mattered." Mike nodded, and the world's about to know it. They stood in silence for a long moment as the sun sank behind the trees, casting long shadows over the port. There was peace in that moment, deep, earned peace. And above them, high in the darkening sky, a single jet passed overhead on its return to base. A whisper of thunder, a whisper of memory, a whisper of Nate Carter. No longer forgotten. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe. And never forget, sometimes the quietest heroes leave the loudest echoes. This wasn't just a story. This was a legacy. See you in the next one.